Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And there are times when we are making our way through the world that it's helpful to hit reset, to consider making some changes in how we're living. And that's why this month in Good Faith, we're in a series that we're calling Hitting Reset. Now, one key aspect of our world is our most intimate relationships. And there's no more intimate relationship than marriages. So what might it look like to hit reset in this realm, especially for those of us who are currently married, thinking about getting married one day, or maybe processing a past marriage? So when I was thinking about who could help me make sense of hitting reset in this way, one person came immediately to mind: Harrison Scott Key. Now, in real life, I am not friends with Harrison Scott Key, but I feel like I know him. And that's because I've really enjoyed his writing, especially his most recent book, How to Stay Married, the Most Insane Love Story Ever. That's his subtitle, not my description, but I think it's accurate. And central to his story in this book is about a dramatic reset he had to hit in his own marriage. And I believe it's filled with lessons for all of us in all of our intimate relationships, whether we're currently married or not. In addition to authoring How to Stay Married, Harrison Scott Key is the author of Congratulations, Who Are You Again? And The World's Largest Man. He's the winner of the very distinguished Thurber Prize for American Humor, also the professor of English at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Harrison, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. It's great to be here.
Well, let's get into your story, which I really think is a great story, and I think your subtitle is accurate. It's a truly insane story. And I'm going to give you kind of space to tell the full dimensions of the insanity of this story. But please give our listeners the hook. What was it about your story that especially makes it insane?
First of all, a lot of people after they read the book would get online and say, "Oh, this is not the most insane love story," or "Oh, I know like 3 stories that are more insane than this one." And I just want to say, the title, like so much in the book, even the subtitle, is hyperbole. So here's the hook. The way I often describe it is a true crime horror novel. This really happened, and there is a murder at the very beginning. And the thing that has been murdered is my marriage. And I spend the entire book trying to figure out, is it really dead? If it is, who killed it? Can it come back to life? Is that even possible? If so, how do we make that happen? Another way to describe the book is that it's a memoir about how my wife sat me down one day and told me that she was in love with our neighbor and wanted to divorce me and marry him. And I was like, which one? There are so many. And she told me, and this was a guy that I had been friends with up until that very moment. At least I thought we were friends. Obviously we weren't. A guy I had borrowed, lawnmowers and pickup trucks from. He had helped me in my yard. I'd helped this guy. And my wife was now in love with him, and I had no idea. And she wanted to marry him. And so it really is kind of a mystery. It's a detective story of like, okay, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Can any of this be reversed? Can my marriage be saved? And who is the real villain here? And that's a big, big question. And we can talk more about that, but that's really what the book's about.
I love all of those questions. It drew me in right from the beginning. And the fact that this is a story of a betrayal, certainly a betrayal in the context of a marriage, but that it is a betrayal to me makes it universal in that regard, because all of us have experienced betrayals and discovery of betrayals in our most intimate relationships, whether it's something we discovered about what our parents really were like or really did, or a great friend, or what happened in our church and so forth. And I read it while I was in the middle of processing a particular betrayal in my own life. And I thought one of the things that I really loved about it was that you were basically modeling this process of retelling a story, that part of a reset in a relationship is going back and re-narrating what happened and re-examining your old narratives. So can you start with that and start with the original narrative before the murder happened, before you discovered the affair? How did you originally narrate your marriage, and then what changed?
We all have these stories we tell about our past, our parents, our friends, where we went to school, all these things that have happened to us. Those generally are pretty surface level stories that we tell ourselves, unless we've been in therapy or unless we're a writer or a storyteller and really process, like, okay, this is the thing that happened, but why did it happen? How did it change me? How am I a different person now? And if anyone's been in therapy, autobiographical writing and therapy are not the same thing, but they do overlap on the Venn diagram of
Yeah.
communication, and there is a lot in common. The story I told myself before all this happened is that, you know, some of it was true and some of it turned out not to be true. But the story I told was that my wife and I were very different people, um, who had a lot in common for to be so different. We had the same sense of humor. We were both kind of darkly cynical, wry. We loved to, make fun of weird pharmaceutical ads and ugly babies. I've heard a comedian say, having shared interests is not typically the basis of a marriage. It's having shared hatreds.
Oh,
Not
okay.
so much, we found that we generally disliked the same things in the
Right.
world, and but we had very little that we liked in common, which is so,
Mm.
and so it was a very kind of opposites attract story that we had. I could, read long into the night and love to watch documentaries about really obscure topics. My wife wants to watch Grey's Anatomy. She doesn't want to read. I love to like cook long meals and sit there for hours at the dinner table. She wants to microwave something and eat it in 5 minutes and be done. I get up very early. She sleeps in. We're just so different, and that was kind of a charming aspect of our marriage. How different we were. Uh, we had three children, three young daughters, and I thought, it had been hard. We'd gone through a hard season. Really, the many, many hard seasons when we got married, and this is in the book, so I'm not giving anything away here. But when we got married, my wife's mother had just passed away, literally like 10 days before the wedding. And so the funeral was in the church, and then the wedding was in the church 10 days later. And so that was really tough. So we had a really rough early part of our marriage, just emotionally. We didn't fight, but my wife was incredibly sad, as you would imagine, having just lost a parent at this kind of most important moment of her life so far. She didn't have a father. They were estranged. He wasn't at the wedding. I was not so much sad as just kind of confused. Like, what am I supposed to do? What kind of husband am I supposed to be to this woman who's grieving? Like, this to show you how bad I was at being a husband to somebody who was grieving. Again, I was 27 at the time. She was maybe 24, 25. So we were still very young. I'd been in college for 10 years. I was just basically a kid at heart. Um, Her mother had just died of cancer, and so I read a play. There was a play called Wit, about a woman who dies of cancer, and it's about her and one of her students. And I was like, oh, there's a movie version of this. Lauren and I should watch this movie. It's like about processing death and all the profundity of it. And like halfway through the movie, she's just bawling, crying, and not in a good way. She's like, why are you making me watch this? This is so awful. I'm just thinking about my mom. And I was like, I thought that would be, I was an idiot. I had no idea. And so we struggled. So that was a dark season. We started having kids. Things were really awesome. We had this young family. Fatherhood was really hard for me. I was born the youngest, and so I'd never babysat. I'd never had little brother, little sister. So learning to be a father was really difficult, but it was such a happy time. Then I became a writer, and I really withdrew from my family. As anybody who's an entrepreneur, a startup founder, if you're an artist or a writer, it takes a long time
Yeah.
to get good at those things. And I was also working full time to provide for my family, with these three small children, ages 0, 2, and 4. It was a lot. So I had all these seasons of like, wow, it was tough at first, and then it was awesome, and then it was a little hard, and we needed therapy there for a while because we were just kind of being mean to each other. But we got through it. I was able to become a writer. I had a professional career, and somehow we had survived. And I was so happy, and I was so relieved, and I felt like we finally made it. And it was right around that time that my wife sat me down to tell me she was leaving me for this other guy. So I had a very wrong picture of what our marriage was like.
So, how do you make sense of that? Like, you've been confronted with, oh my gosh, my marriage is not what I thought it was. My past is not what I thought I was. And I think, especially, I am not who I thought I was, which that's really, I think, one of the great gifts of your book is you turn that re-narration inward. And that's a key part of that reset process. So how does that happen? Or how did it happen for you, at least?
Well, it's a very long, it's sort of like, I don't know, it's a long process. With a lot of punctuated, emergent, urgent moments. Obviously, when you find out that your wife's having an affair and wants to divorce you, that's a big moment. And that starts the ball rolling toward the reset. But it also, in some ways, the process of sort of figuring out who I am and who she is and what our marriage is now is still happening, even almost 8 years after that moment, which she first sat me down and told me that. So we're still figuring it out, and I think we'll be figuring it out for a long time. What it means is you can't throw away every memory of what you were. You can't
Mm.
say, oh, this must have all been a lie, but you have to immediately suspect everything. So like I'm like, oh, so like part of it I was like, yeah, I was gone a lot while I was working on my first book. I was at the coffee shop down the street when it came out. I was on book tour across the country. So some of it I got immediately. I'm like, oh yeah, and this may sound weird to listeners, but I had already kind of processed some of my failures as a father right before she told me
Mm.
this. So I was equipped to understand, or at least have some language to understand what she was telling me. So one of my first thoughts was, well, in one sense, I get it. I wasn't here, and this guy was. He was our neighbor. He lived right next door. So like rationally, I got that. I mean, I wasn't happy about it, and I was very angry about it. But I was like, okay, like so that memory of me working too hard, maybe, and neglecting my family a little bit, not a lot. I don't want anybody to get the illusion that I was gone, like I was never interacting with my kids or my wife. Like I did not have any hobbies other than writing. I was never at the golf course. I do not fish. I don't watch professional football or professional sports of any kind. I mean, I was mostly home, but again, I was often gone, or was often at my desk, often in my office, or reading a book or working through a story. So I understood that part of that I hadn't been that present, and then that maybe had opened the door for my wife to form this relationship with this other man. A lot of my just being gone or distracted, I was still in the house. I just
Mm.
wasn't seeing it. I wasn't seeing my wife's pain or her first frustration. I remember one particularly bad moment, way before the confession, where I was really struggling with my career, and I felt like I was wasting my time on my dream to be an author. And while my other friends were putting all of their work into their careers or into their families. Like they were either coaching the soccer team and the baseball team, or they were working longer hours at the office to get the promotion. Whereas I'm just working on a book that nobody wants to read or can read, and it's not even finished. And so I was really getting frustrated with myself. And I remember Lauren's telling me she wanted more help around the house. And I flipped, and I was like, I I told her, I said, I want help too. Nobody can help me. And it was a very selfish thing. She took it very selfishly. And it sounds very selfish. There's a part of it that's true, though. Like, she wanted help from me. And I'm like, I can't give you any more help. I'm trying to figure out how to do something that's so difficult. And I think I'm an idiot for trying, but I don't want to stop trying right
Mm.
now. And that just shows you sort of how differently we saw the world. Like she said,
Yeah.
I want you to help me, and I'm like, I want you to help me. Can you help me write my book? I mean, it was an honest question, but there was a lot of other things that I had to unlearn and unremember because they weren't true. Which is And there were so many times, especially in the previous 3 years right before the confession, where my wife had pulled away from me while I was very intentionally pursuing her.
Mm.
And I thought she was just doing that because she was mean or in a bad mood or hangry. Uh, and I was like, oh no, she did not want to have sex with me that night because she was having sex with somebody else.
Wow.
And she had a boyfriend. I didn't even know my wife had a boyfriend. Everything becomes so complicated and layered. And that's what's really important, to have good friends and prefer really a great therapist, maybe even two of them. You need people you can talk with about your memories so you can kind of piece together who you are, because your memory, the story you tell yourself about yourself is who you are. That's
Yeah.
you. That's the you moving through the world making decisions. So when everything in the past is now called into question, you don't really know who you are anymore.
Mm.
And you've got to find that out if you're going to save your family. If you're, no matter what's happened, it's addiction, alcoholism, gambling, abuse, infidelity, to put your life and your family back together again, you really do have to find out who you are, and that means talking it out with friends. Even as it's happening, you have to talk to people.
Harrison, I love that insight that who we are in the world is the stories we're telling about ourselves. And that means we're changing and growing all the time. And if because our stories are changing as we experience new things, as we make new sense of even our past, the way you're describing. Not all of us, of course, have such a dramatic, inciting plot incident the way you did, but many have. And I wanted to ask what that was like for your wife as well, because you write this book, and I think many listeners will be like, oh my gosh, did the wife want this story told? Did this wife want is she getting outed against her will? Can you explain a little bit how it, as I read the book, and especially as I came to that really lovely chapter that your wife actually wrote, it became apparent, oh, this is a joint process of re-narration that's going on. Can you describe more what that was like?
She did not want me to write this book at first. After our reconciliation, and I won't spoil it for listeners, but the period of time covered in the book is about 4 years, 3 or 4 years. Um, and it starts off really bad. There are a lot of flashbacks. It starts off bad, it gets better, then it gets really bad, and then it gets better. So there are a lot of twists and turns in the book. And when she came home in 2021 after a separation, when things had gotten really, really awful, and this man was still involved, she was still involved with this man. Um, we reconciled, or we attempted to begin reconciling. I'll say that. I remember the day she came home, and I won't give away sort of how it all happens, but the day she came home, I said, "Do you really want to be married to me? Like, seriously, like, you don't have to be. Like, nobody's making you come back here. Nobody's making you stay. Um, like, she had a job, she had income. We had agreed that we could have joint custody of the children. Like, she had every means to not stay married to me. I said, "Do you really want to be married?" And she said, "I want to try." And that was like her first, like, real honest statement to me. She didn't say yes. She didn't say I love you. She didn't, please take me back. She said, "I want to try and be married to you. I would like to try and fall in love with you again." And I was like, all right, that's fair. And so we agreed. We agreed to try. And so that was in late winter of 21. And I had been writing a book of essays that were sort of exploring um, religion and sort of my tortured experience with religion. I am a Christian, and there have a lot of. I firmly believe that, like, Christians can make better fun of Christians than anyone else. Like,
This is true.
we understand what's wrong with them. And so I'd kind of been writing about that, which had led to me writing about my marriage as everything was just kind of disintegrating around me. And I'd put that book aside, and I picked it back up again after she came home. And I thought, that maybe this is a book about marriage. And because I'd been going through, I mean, we'd gone through this insane experience this twisty turny experience that involved our church and all these people in Savannah and our families and just everything. It was crazy, and the whole experience, was the wildest, strangest experience of my life. And as a nonfiction writer, that's sort of what you look for in the stories that you write: something strange and weird and wild that people are not going to believe. And if it happened to you, like, by all means, tell the story. Maybe you'll learn something true about what it means to be human. And so I started writing this book, and I told her, because we were in therapy like 3 times a week. She was in therapy with her guy. I was in therapy with my lady, and then we were in marriage counseling together with a third guy. So it was
You
like,
were tag teaming this thing.
dude, it was like we were getting so much healing done. And it was intense. This was, when you're in therapy, like when something really terrible has just happened, it's very intense.
Yeah.
You're crying, you're bawling, you're snotty, you're having these amazing realizations and epiphanies like in every session. It was very intense. And I thought, I did not know marriage was going to be like this. I did not know this is what it felt like to get cheated on, or to come to the brink of divorce. I did not know what it would feel like to be so abjectly humiliated in front of my community. I've got to tell this story so other people know. Men, women, anybody who's been cheated on. I wanted this story out there. And I said, hey, Lauren, what do you think? Like, maybe this is a book. And she said, like, she looked at me like I was insane. She was like, why would you ever want to tell this story? And I'm like, but that's how she feels about anything. I mean, when I was telling the story for my first book about my dad, and who was a bit of a racist and a bit of a misogynist. I don't know if you can be a bit of a racist if you're just a racist or not. But,
it's like being a bit pregnant, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
he was a little pregnant with his racism and misogyny, and I loved the man, but he was a strange, complicated character, and he was abusive. And so when I wrote that story, she looked at me the same way, like, why would you tell the world this?
Yeah.
I'm like, it's no skin off my back. Like, let me tell the story. I think there are other people out there that have complicated relationships with their fathers. So when it came time for this marriage book, I'd been writing about my life and sort of the explosions and weird, wondrous moments of my life for a long, long time. So it wasn't weird to me to write this. I knew I would be humiliated. I knew people would hate me. I knew other people would feel seen. I knew other people would feel confirmed in their own feelings. And I thought, let me just get it out there. I can take it. She didn't want it out there. She said, can't you just write about the dog? Like, people love books about dogs. And we have a dog named Gary, and he's in the book, and he's really awesome. And
Gary gets a whole chapter to himself, as I remember.
Yeah, Gary makes several appearances in the book. And she was like, can't you just write about Gary? And I was like, yeah, not, but I feel like this is the thing to be writing about. So I said, you know what? I'm not going to bring it up to her again. I'm just going to finish this book, because it was very therapeutic just to write it and to go back and remember how we met, how we fell in love, how we fell out of love, all the things that happened. And so I wrote it, and I wrote it very quickly. It took me less than a year to write this book,
Wow.
which is like, normally it takes me like 5 years to write a book. And I gave it to her. That was probably the most frightening part of the whole experience of the infidelity, the separation, all of that, was giving my wife the book, because what I'm doing is I'm saying, this is how it felt to be me. And I think this is going to hurt you, but I think you need to read it.
Wow.
And she read it very quickly. I wanted to throw up like every 5 minutes while she was reading it. And she came back and she said she was a little shocked. And I asked her, what was she shocked by? And she said she was shocked that it was funny. She did not expect it to be funny. And I'm like, well, I am a funny writer. Like, I do write kind of pretty stupid.
You did win an award for humor, I believe, right?
I'm like, that's, if you told me to write a, eulogy for Abraham Lincoln, I'd probably make it funny. That's just how my brain works. And that's how I experience the world. She said, I thought it would be funnier. She said, I thought it wouldn't be funny. She goes, also thought it would be a lot sadder and a lot angrier. She goes, it was sad, but not as angry as I thought it would be. And she actually gave me some editorial tips, which I thought blew my mind. She actually said, so the name of the guy that she was with, I guess you could call him her boyfriend. His name is Chad. That's not his real name. And I was like, she gave me her editorial feedback on the manuscript, which is hard, right? You've just read a book that's from this person that you hurt, and it's about the worst thing you've ever done in your life,
Yeah.
according to Lauren. I was like, do you have any feedback? Like, were the chapters too long? Did it drag at all? And she said, it would be a lot funnier if you weren't so mean to Chad. And
All right.
I was like, what? Some pretty big balls on my wife to suggest I be nicer to her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. But she actually made a really good point, which is that a lot of my anger, a lot of people did sense way more anger in the book than I think is there. But she said it seemed angriest and bitterest when you were describing him. And I was trying to make fun of him. I mean, he's just kind of a regular Joe, kind of a hardcore normie, like a guy I famously make fun of his cargo shorts and his flip flops and his Michelob Ultra. Not a this guy was not like a sexy stud investment banker. He was just a kind of a dude. And she said you were just kind of mean to him a little bit, and it kind of started to take me out of the story, and it made me feel sorry for you. And I was like, oh, that's a really good point. So I took all the times that I kind of made fun of this guy, and I like highlighted them in the manuscript, and I deleted probably about half of them. I'm like, she's right. I don't need to keep making fun of this guy. She gave really good advice about the book. Then she asked if she could write something for it, and I was secretly hoping that she would ask that,
Mm.
because I was afraid to ask her to write something. But she did. She wrote this beautiful chapter, and it can be very psychologically, spiritually, emotionally healing to really say, I think this is what happened. And it's mostly hypothesis. When you
Yeah.
write about yourself, you're just saying, I think this is how it all went down. And I think this is how it changed me. And so reading her story was so powerful.
Well, that's interesting to hearing all this backstory, Harrison, because I could sense as a reader that that the act of writing was a way for you to re-narrate your past and make sense of it and get to some sort of healing. And obviously, the book, not to give away the full ending, describes how you do that as a marriage. But to hear that the act of the writing of the book itself collectively was part of your therapy together, part of
Yeah.
your healing, you're sharing each other's stories, getting feedback. I've never thought about that as actually a process of reconciliation, but that's to be able to have to write something together and give edits and feedback to the other person's account. That's a beautiful picture of actually coming together with our stories. And so
Yeah.
that's a lovely exercise. I mean, not everybody can do it, but if you can, it seems like there's something really beautiful about it.
It did feel like, once I realized, so I knew that our marriage was not going to survive even when she came home, because we weren't sure. Like, we knew like we could try therapy for 6 months and it might be like, this just can't work. We just got to stop. Like, I didn't know how I was going to feel any particular day. I might, the anger might outweigh the desire to forgive on any given day. So we didn't know if we were going to survive or not. And I knew that if we were, as a married couple, that we would both have to agree on what happened.
Yeah.
That we would have to, like, okay, here's how I was a terrible husband. I did this and this and this. Now here's some reasons that I did those things, and those are good reasons. Why did I stay longer at the office? Because I knew that's how I'm going to get the bonus at work, and that's going to pay for Christmas, right? Like, there's a, we all, so many of us in marriage do the wrong thing for the right reason, or the right thing for the wrong
Yeah.
reason, and I knew that we would have to agree on everything that happened. Like, it's very easy to agree, yes, infidelity is wrong, having an affair is wrong. Like, that's the hardest part of all this, because it's so easy to put you in opposite camps from your spouse. Uh, am I a jackass? 100%. I can be the biggest jackass in any circumstance or context, and I talk about that in the book. Um, but did I have an affair? I did not. Is my wife like this really nice, funny person who's like this amazing mother, and all her friends love her, and everybody who reads my books wants to meet her and be her friend? Is all that true? Yes. Did she have an affair? Yes. So instantly she's the villain, and I'm the abused, I'm the betrayed, I'm the one who has been attacked and hurt here. That's the hardest part when something like this happens, because you stand on the moral high ground when your
Yeah.
spouse cheats, And as Lauren says in the book, after we reconciled, like any fight we had, like about what to eat for dinner, like she would just let me win. She's like, well, do we have tacos or pizza? And I'm like, I want tacos. She wants pizza. She goes, well, I guess we're having tacos because I had an affair and you win. Like that really did like animate. And I wasn't sitting there going, yeah, you had an affair, so we get tacos. It just colored every
Yeah.
conversation even after she came home. And so I knew we had to have the same story. What happened? Why did it happen? And we couldn't come up with every answer. We're not God. We don't see, with omniscience. But by pouring both of our stories out in therapy and also on paper, I knew we would have to have the same story and we'd have to agree, yes, this is what happened. But I also knew that the book coming out that the journey wasn't over yet. Because if I really was going to write this book, publish this book, and then go on tour and do interviews like this, that we were going to have to be okay with kind of living in that nightmare with other people as they read the book. And
Mm.
that has turned out to be way harder than I thought it would be. Like this isn't hard now, talking to you, the book came out a year and a half ago. This is probably, and I'm not making this up, this is probably like my 200th podcast
Yeah.
interview to do.
Sure.
My favorite so far, by the way. This is
Of
absolutely
course, I assume so, but
my
thank
favorite.
you for saying so, Harrison.
But the first year the book came out, it was really hard because every time I would do an interview or do a book event, I would come home just with this heaviness on me, like, oh, I'm so tired of telling people this story. And then
Yeah.
a voice would pop in my head, like, well, you wrote it, you idiot. Like, what do you expect? Like, you know what book promotion looks like. But I really thought by writing the book and hitting that period at the end of the manuscript that somehow I would be leaving it behind. And I had to realize that no, I probably wasn't going to be leaving it behind for a while because other people were going to react to it.
We're doing this conversation as part of a larger series on hitting reset. And in particular, how do we hit reset in our most intimate relationships, especially our marriage? And that's what we're talking with Harrison Scott Key, who himself had to hit a very hard reset in his own marriage. Harrison, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book and why I thought it was applicable was because your insights, I think, are much more universal than, say, applying to a couple who is struggling with an affair. Now, if you are one, I think this book is a great book to kind of have a way to process that. But there's a number of insights there that I think pertain certainly to any marriage and the struggles of any marriage and almost any intimate relationship, period. So I'll just read two quotes that I particularly enjoyed. You write, long before I knew of her, your wife's love for Chad, the one she had or her relationship with, affair with, I knew of her loathing of me. We did what all loving married couples do, growing haggard and sad and quietly seething with contempt. Now, there's something there. And then later on, you write, I think most divorces are merely a failure of imagination. You lose the capacity to conceive of a happy future. I thought that was really, really insightful that, these are dynamics that maybe especially accelerate towards an affair, but I think destroy many marriages and many just loving relationships is this slow creep of contempt that can just very subtly come into relationships, even unconsciously, and then also losing this capacity to conceive of a happy future together. Can you say more about either those or other dynamics that really transcend a marriage struggling with fear and that really extend to any intimate relationship?
To keep it alive, if you plant, if you're a new homeowner, one of the things that I learned when I became a new homeowner, I knew this theoretically, but I knew it in a different way. Once I bought a house, I planted all these beautiful flowers and things in the yard. And then about 6 months later, I realized like you can't just let them go. Like you have to do stuff to them. You can't
Yeah.
just plant things. Like I just wanted to that's why I love trees. You plant a tree, you're just leaving it alone for like 100 years. But when you're planting in a flower bed, you have to continually work at it, and it's a pain. You have to weed it. You have to, schedule reminders in your phone or on your calendar to get fertilizer, or new, pine straw, new flowers for the new season. And a marriage is very much like that. And I know that's a cliche that you really have to tend the garden of your marriage. I just I thought I was doing that, and I clearly
Mm,
was not. Um, and that's, I think the second law of thermodynamics applies to marriage as much as it applies to anything else, that you will, if left to its own devices, 99% of marriages, you'll grow tired and haggard and seething with quiet contempt. You just will. Your spouse becomes your greatest enemy through no fault of their own. They're just there. They're the ones who are
yeah.
always there. So when bad things happen, like there's so many times with Lauren where we'll be fighting, or one of us will be complaining about something that didn't go right, like at the house, like the coffee maker broke, or the cookies that we were cooking in the oven burned, and we'll complain to the other one. And then whoever's getting complained to will say, "How is that my fault? Like, why are you mad at me? Like, why are you mad at me about the cookies
You're
that you
just
burnt?"
there. That's why, right? Yeah, yeah,
And that happens so often in marriages, that there's so many barbs and paper cuts that you get in
yeah,
life. They just happen continually. You're struggling with money, you're struggling with your weight, whatever you're struggling with, and your spouse is right there. And they're not going to be as typically, they're not going to be as empathetic and compassionate as, say, a therapist would be,
yeah,
because your spouse has seen you every day. Like, they're over it, and it's just so easy for that contempt to grow. So one thing I've learned is that, like, when I find myself feeling weird towards my wife, maybe she said something mean, maybe I said something mean, maybe just things start to feel a little distant,
yeah,
maybe we haven't had sex in a while, maybe there's a good reason, maybe because she's been sick, and maybe because I've been working or I've been sick and whatever. But anytime I start to feel distance, whether I don't know why we're feeling distance, or whether because we were fighting, I try not to let that sit
mm,
too long. Just
yeah,
like, you get a little paper cut on your arm. If you don't put Neosporin on it, it could get infected, right? They usually
yeah,
don't, but sometimes do. And this is so obvious and common sense, but it's not. What's hard about it is the awareness to know when that tension is there and needs to be addressed. Sometimes it's fine. Like last night I came home, and I was my wife bought a new appliance, and she hadn't set it up yet. And this is an appliance that I'm very familiar with. So I was like, oh, let me get this set up. So I start setting it up. And she comes over and she starts kind of like ordering me around and like what to do with it. And I was like, do you want to, like, you can do it if you want. I was like, I was just doing it to be helpful, but if you, it sounds like you really want to do it. And like, so we started fighting, and I was like, clearly she's in a mood, like whatever. Maybe she had a bad day. She'd been home all day. She was sick. I have to say, Curtis, I was not in the mood. I was fine. I did nothing wrong. I just got home. I was just being helpful. But I was like, you know what? I fixed it. I did not keep running my mouth. I fixed the appliance. And then I went outside to throw the ball with the dog. Like, I would have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have left that encounter with a little bit of resentment, and I would have nursed it into a little slightly bigger ball of resentment. And I would have thrown that ball at my wife later. Like I would have hurled it at her that night after dinner or the next morning without telling her why. So I have way more emotional awareness now after this
mm,
whole experience. I'm like, she's kind of in a bad mood, but I don't think I did anything. And it's not so bad that she needs to go to therapy about it, but I'm just going to leave her alone for a while.
yeah,
And I've solved so many problems just by leaving my wife alone. I'm like, oh, we shouldn't argue about this. Like, if she's in a mood to argue, that's fine, because sometimes I am too. So sometimes you don't have to address every little thing that goes wrong. But
sure,
if that had happened 3 or 4 days in a row,
yeah,
it's like, we need to talk. Like, what's
yeah,
up? How you doing? And I just would not have done that before. And
mm,
when I did do it before, my wife would not respond with anything helpful because she didn't really have those tools. So it's really just about having good EQ. Like I do that so much better now. I would still screw it up a bunch, but just having a little more awareness of how's everything going? What's the psychic energy at home right now?
yeah,
Being tuned into that. It's hard for
yeah,
men. Very hard for
yeah.
men.
It is. Harrison, one of the beautiful things I love about your book, it is certainly a memoir about your marriage, the death and resurrection of your marriage. It's also a beautiful spiritual memoir. I think it's a memoir of you spiritually finding God, and that these journeys intersect. So, can you describe more? Connect the dots. How did your spiritual journey that you were on intersect with this marriage journey that you were on?
Yeah.
Also,
Well, in one sense, it's the sort of most obvious rational connection. Like, why is there so much God in the book?
yeah,
Essentially, is what you're asking.
mhm,
Um, and because I knew it would be alienating to a lot of people
yeah,
who aren't really into religion. I've tried to write it in a way that would not alienate flaming pagans, because I'm very good friends with many. All my best friends are flaming pagans. I'm literally the only Christian that these people know. But it was a very conscious decision to talk about religion in the book, even though I knew would be a turnoff to some. Also knew it would be very positive for other people. They'd be like, "Oh, this man's talking about faith," and so I knew it would be controversial, and that's fine. But I knew I couldn't avoid it, because first of all, like the very idea of marriage is so closely linked to the history of religion, that it's just like the ideas in the book of love and forgiveness and mercy and justice. All these things are these are all religious ideas, right? The idea of love or mercy or justice, those ideas don't just come out of nothing. They come
yeah,
from uh, thousands of years of deep and profound philosophy and religion and theology. So, in some ways, at its very root DNA, this book is going to have to address these
mm,
things.
yeah,
Um, but I also knew that I professed to be a Christian. And so when all this happened, and I knew if I wanted to save my marriage, I was going to have to forgive my wife. I was going to have to confess my own crimes against my
mm,
wife. And Christianity gave me a way to explore those ideas. It was almost like, when you move into an old house, sometimes there's an old shed in the backyard. And if you go into the old shed at the house you just bought, there are a bunch of old rusty tools hanging in that shed. And you don't know what those tools do anymore. They did something like 50 years ago, but not anymore. Well, that's sort of what my faith was like to me. It was like this shed in the backyard that I'd grown up in the church, and it was full of all these tools, and an old rusty shovel that said forgiveness, and an old rusty
mm.
plow that said confession or whatever. And I just opened the door to the shed, and I was like, all right, let's see if any of this works, because I don't have any idea what to do now.
Well, I found myself after reading it like, wow, this is why I'm a Christian, because it has the storehouse of tools that don't make the pain go away by any means, but gives you some way to actually respond to it. Gives you some way, especially to narrate it, re-narrate it, and especially re-narrate ourselves, re-examine ourselves with all of these tools of love, mercy, forgiveness, justice, confession. One of the things I loved about this book, Harrison, is that you do have a lot of these insights that I think are very profound, that are born out of, like you said, going back to the shed of spiritual knowledge and insight, especially from Christianity. But you somehow make it all funny. I mean, I hope that listeners really get a sense that this is a funny book. I was laughing my way through it at multiple times. This is written by the Thurber Award-winning humorist, one of the highest awards you can get as a humorist. This is a funny book, and I found myself after I closed the book thinking, how did he make this happen? How did he do this to make an absolutely awful, awful experience, as I projected myself of what it was like for me to go through discovering my wife had an affair. Like, I could not make that funny. Like, that something was happening. And it made me like reflect more on the nature of humor. And I wondered, is the fact that you are a humorist, and maybe let's just say particularly a humorist infused with Christian beliefs and values and practices, but somehow with the humor part contributed to your ability to forgive, to actually not just savage, not stick the knife in a particularly clever way, but to actually forgive. And I thought about that, especially when I turned back to, I think this is in your quote at the beginning of your book from Chesterton, when you said, quoted Chesterton saying, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. And I think that's what best humor does, is they take themselves lightly. And it struck me that boy, there's some connection between humor that takes oneself lightly and forgiveness, because there's something about forgiveness that requires taking our own sense of grievance, hurt, betrayal a little less lightly than we are naturally inclined to do. Am I onto anything that there's some connection between humor and forgiveness?
Yeah, there's definitely a connection. And if you when you're it's hard to think about when you're actually writing humor. When you're actually writing it, you're not thinking about these deep connections between forgiveness and laughter or whatever. You're just, there's a lot of material when this happens to you. People, first of all, people say, like, how could you write a funny book about the worst experience of your life? Um, and the answer to that is, if clearly it's never happened to them. uh, you know, uh, Most people I know who've been betrayed, and who've been cheated on, have a great sense of humor about it, because it is such a horrible thing to learn. And it creates so many absurd situations. Like one that I describe in the book. I remember I was at the chiropractor and I was filling out the questionnaire, and he's like, the questionnaire is like, are you married or divorced, or married and separated? Do you live with your wife? And I was like answering all these questions, thinking, like, why does the chiropractor care if I live with my wife? I'm sure there's an insurance reason for that question, but like, you find yourself in these moments where I just wanted to storm up to the front desk and be like, yeah, let me, here's a screenshot of my wife's address. Like, what else does this guy want to know? You just find yourself so angry for the stupidest reasons, or trying to explain. Like, I remember, like, a friend's parent came to the house after Lauren had already moved out, but we didn't want people to know she had moved out yet. So she came back and we pretended to live there together while this person was there. And it was like the birdcage. I mean, it was just total farce the whole time. A lot of funny things happen when tragedy happens.
Yeah.
So that's, take that, for starters. There's just a lot of material. Anybody I know I get a lot of calls and DMs from people who've had this happen and they want to talk to somebody about it. I mean, every week I get probably 5 or 6 emails, direct messages from strangers saying, please help me with this
Yeah.
problem in my marriage. And sometimes I get those from friends, and anytime I talk to them, like, we're laughing within 5 minutes because it's that terrible.
Yeah.
Like, when a friend calls me, she's like, I just found out that my husband is having an affair with his college intern, and he's just been fired, so we're going to lose our house and da da da. But we're laughing about it because it's so awful and terrible. So it's a funny situation if you've lived through it. Now, there are some people who live through this and never want to laugh about it, and that's fine. If that feels a little bitter, that feels too much resentment to me, that's probably not healthy. But you're not thinking about any of that when you're writing. But to your question, when something like this happens, you feel like you're the victim. And as I said earlier, you feel like you have the moral high ground. And that's a terrible place to be.
Yeah.
It's a terrible place to be a victim, to have the moral high ground. That's not a natural place for me at all. I'm usually the bad guy, and I'm usually done the worst thing in the room.
Well, it's a dangerous place for us all spiritually to
Yes,
occupy that space for too
yeah,
long.
pride
Yeah.
goeth before a fall.
Yeah.
I did not like that place, and I knew that to write this book, I would have to not take myself so seriously, because you've been wounded. Like, it is, anyone who's been betrayed by their spouse knows how cosmically awful the feeling is, and how long it lasts, and how much it hurts. It hurts physically. You can't sleep, you can't eat. It is just the worst. And part of the reason it feels so bad is because you're the most important person in the universe, and you've been wronged, right, by someone in that universe. And I was like, oh, this is not a good place to be. I need to take myself lightly here. I need to make fun of myself as much as I want to lash out at my wife, at Chad, at other people who maybe helped this bad thing happen or encouraged it to happen. I was going to have to be as much a villain as anybody and take myself lightly and give it to myself as hard as I was giving it to anyone else in the book. And so that is a profound philosophical move that does make the comedy easier. It also, it's a sad story, and I did not want to bum people out for 350 pages. I was like, if I'm going to keep these people reading, I need to remind them that like life is okay. If I'm saying something funny in the book, then the reader picks up on that unconsciously. Well, this guy must have made it out
Yeah.
okay if he can write this.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a hope in the humor too. Like if he
Mm.
can make a joke about it, maybe that gives me hope for when I go through the really terrible thing.
Yeah. Well, Harrison, thank you so much for this great conversation. I want to ask you to kind of give a final benedictory insight for all of our listeners who are contemplating that they may need to do a reset, whether it's hard or moderate or soft, but they're contemplating need to do a reset, maybe my marriage or in a very intimate relationship of some sort. What's your word to them about how they embark on that process?
Well, you probably shouldn't do it alone. You need good, strong people in your life. You need friends who you do need a therapist, but you need friends. If you don't have friends, every life is going to run off into the ditch many
Mm,
times. And if you don't have anybody there to help you get that car out of the ditch, it's just going to stay there, and it's going to be a very sad life. So you've got to have friends. You've got to be willing to throw out you have to be willing to let go of the things that you value the most if you really want to
mm,
do a reset.
wow.
You have to an Isaac, a sacrificing Isaac on the altar like Abraham did. You have to. What do you love the most? What do you take the most pride in? Is it your money? Is it for me? It was definitely writing, and my gift to be able to write. My being the funny guy that could somehow get through any situation with his sense of humor. I had to give that up and write this book that in many places is a very sad book. I had to give that up. I had to become somebody to the world that I didn't want to become. I had to become
Mm,
this like spiritual marriage guru. I did not want to be that guy. I had to give up the just sort of silly, funny, humorist role that I had played for so long. If you want to reset, you definitely have to be willing to give up these things that you really value. And, you know, you could call them your idols or you could call them your identifying characteristics or whatever it is. But you're probably going to have to give many or all of those up forever or just for a little while.
mm. A good word. Harrison, thank you so much for taking us through a horrifying but also hilarious journey through this book. Again, that book is How to Stay Married, The Most Insane Love Story Ever by Harrison Scott Key. We'll put links to the book in the show notes as well as some of his other writings as well. Listeners, thank you for joining us as we are talking about how to do resets in our lives in this series. And we will be back next week when we gather around the campfire.